moment to introduce one another in the chat. So if you're joining us tonight, please drop your name, maybe affiliation, or where you're tuning in from into the chat box. Give you just a minute to do that. Recognize a few names, some supporters of ours from the philanthropic community, some board members, a couple staff folk as well. Thank you all so much for being on. I'm coming to you from our downtown Baltimore office. We've got folks joining us from the car. Impressive. Terry from the Able Foundation. Hi, Barbara, our board member. Margaret Williams, board member. Again, some BRHP staff. Our Housing Mobility Director, Sean Walton. Hi, Dan Pontius from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. Hello to Pam Young. Pamela, it's great to see you. Not sure if you're on the East Coast or West Coast right now, but glad that you're here. Well, I am Adria Crutchfield, the Executive Director of the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. We are a Baltimore-based nonprofit with the mission of expanding housing choice for families with low incomes who have historically been excluded from housing and opportunities in well-resourced neighborhoods. As the regional administrator of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, we couple housing choice vouchers with counseling services to support over 4,300 families, primarily families with children, in accessing safe, healthy, and economically vibrant communities throughout the Baltimore region. For a look at our 2023 legislative priorities, we want to encourage you to visit our website. I believe a link will be in the chat for you to see our policy and advocacy efforts. We strongly believe that providing access to opportunities for families to thrive is an area where we all can and should do more. And that's one of the reasons we host events like this tonight, to be able to learn from experts who are steeped in history, policy, and research to help us chart a fair, inclusive, and just way forward. And one of the questions we hope tonight's discussion will answer is, what does it take to achieve equity in homeownership across race and class? Which brings me to our guest speaker, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad. Dedrick is the Chief of Organizing, Policy, and Equity at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. He oversees 5 departments there: organizing, policy, government affairs, research, and racial economic equity. Dedrick previously worked at Prosperity Now, where he was a senior fellow and founder of the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative. Before working at Prosperity Now, Dedrick was the Senior Director of the Economic Department at the NAACP and a Senior Organizer and Research Associate at the Institute for Policy Studies and Crisis Director and National Field Director for Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network. Dedrick is an expert in racial economic inequality analysis, particularly how it relates to the racial wealth divide, and he happens to be a Howard County, Maryland resident, and we are so pleased to learn from him this evening. So with that, I'd like to give him a few minutes to introduce himself. And Dedrick, if we need to allow you to share the screen, let us know.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just talk straight for myself, if that's fine. Again, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, glad to be with all of you. As mentioned, I live in Howard County. I live in Columbia. I actually grew up in Columbia. Baltimore, I think a lot of people in Columbia, it's like either DC is their city or Baltimore is their city. For me, Baltimore is my city. It's where I lived right before I moved back to Columbia. It's where I go to mosque. It's kind of the area of where I like to be active. Though now that my kids are going to school here, I'm getting more and more involved in Columbia. We actually just did a report, one of my first local reports, my first and only local report on Columbia at 55, Columbia, Maryland at 55. The subtitle was "Creeping Segregation and Lack of Affordable Housing Threatens a Legacy of Black and White." And I always thought the ideals of Columbia were interesting. I was trying to get more into the analysis of the realities of Columbia and what is happening with this idea of a multi-class, multiracial community that was supposed to be affordable for most Americans. And actually, the long story short was recognizing that Columbia really was never that affordable for the median income household in the United States. And I think, that is a challenge, or probably one of the primary challenge around home ownership and housing in the country. And I always point to Baltimore. I think Baltimore City is one of the most affordable areas in the, kind of DMV area. And how can that be utilized to strengthen community? I think, again, we live in one of the highest income states in the country, one of the more prosperous states. So how can we take one of the areas that still has some affordable housing and make it accessible to those in Baltimore and make it an anchor of affordable housing that we need more throughout Maryland and the country? So just a little bit about myself, Columbia, and my kind of local credentials.
I appreciate that. And you said that you grew up in Columbia, and you also then chose to raise your family in Howard County. Could you maybe just tell us a bit about why?
Yeah, grew up in Columbia, decided to raise my kids in Columbia. I mean, the thing I like about Columbia, and I think it's actually central to what it takes to create economic mobility and opportunity, is that one, intentionality. You don't just kind of fall into um, areas of opportunity. Those areas of opportunity are created, are developed, and I think Columbia, Maryland was designed intentionally to be communities, to have single-family homes next to townhomes, next to apartments, to have assets of playgrounds, of walking paths. Originally, the idea is that you could walk to every town center, whether it be a grocery store and local swimming pools, and have all of these accesses and access to opportunity, and a strong public school system that would help those of all different income levels advance. And I think there was a lot of success there. I think also what happened is, as Columbia developed, people came less to be part of a multi-class, multiracial community and just saw an elite suburb and moved in just for that. And we started seeing more of neighborhoods that are all single-family home beyond the affordability of most, and started replicating some of the worst aspects of kind of suburban life that is disconnected and not available to all. But I still, moved to Columbia. I still really appreciate, and during COVID, loved having the path system and having this area where I could, just take my kids out, and if you don't want to spend a lot of money, still have a good day out with the kids, and my daughter now is starting middle school here, the public school areas, and seeing, it's a huge benefit to be able to have a school that you can feel comfortable, feel strong with your kid attending, and the many programs that come out of that. So that's something that, needs to be replicable. And again, I think, it's those public assets that allow for individual and household growth. And I think that's an important aspect of Columbia.
Absolutely. Howard County remains a very popular choice for many of the families in BRHP's program for a lot of the same reasons that you just described. Perhaps for those who aren't as familiar in the audience with NCRC, you could just give us high-level sense of the work of NCRC, and then I'll dive into our questions.
Sure. National Community Reinvestment Coalition was founded, I always mess this up, I think right around 1990. And the idea of National Community Reinvestment Coalition originally was bringing together local community development organizations to defend and advocate around the Community Reinvestment Act. Community Reinvestment Act is an important piece of legislation that, following, around 1960, I mean, I guess you could argue 1963 onward, there was important legislation like the Voting Rights Act and different civil rights bills, but important economic components of addressing racial economic inequality. We've seen that there was a lot around the war against poverty. We see that there was the Community Reinvestment Act, the Fair Housing Act. All of these are the recognition that if we wanted to address racial inequality, we have to address racial economic inequality. And the Community Reinvestment Act was a piece of legislation that was supposed to help hold financial institutions accountable to invest in lower income areas, and in particular areas that had been disinvested in. And so in the 1990s, there were some attacks on the CRA. Groups came together and organized to try to strengthen the CRA. We're actually about to have the most probably important update of the rule of the Community Reinvestment Act come out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Right now, we have 750 membership organizations across the country, do a host of work from policy to research to different types of advocacy, including community benefit agreements, where we'll pull together 20, 30 local organizations with a major financial institution and discuss with them what they need to do to hold truer to the spirit of CRA and how to better invest in communities.
And is that a final rule that you mentioned, or is it just the beginning of the public comment period for the rule that's coming out soon?
Final rule.
Final rule. Okay. Good to know. We'll keep an eye out for that. So from your perspective, what are some of the challenges that African Americans face in accessing home ownership, building wealth through home ownership, particularly those with lower incomes, and how have those challenges kind of impacted the greater Black community?
Sure. Let me start off with kind of, I think the broad challenge that really got me into this work around racial economic inequality. As you mentioned my bio, and I've done a lot of different work and racial justice and trying to strengthen communities. And I worked for Reverend Sharpton, as mentioned, for a few years, and was kind of surprised. This is back in 2001, 2002. He was known for his police brutality work at that time, but how much he was actually involved in different type of economic issues of trying to get stronger investments in either cities that had large Black populations, or government contracts to businesses, and was reconnecting with this idea that racial economic inequality is the foundation of a racial inequality. And so was really became focused on that, and been focused on that the last 20 something years. And just about a month ago, we put out a report called Still a Dream: Over 500 Years to Black Economic Equality. And that report was looking at where Blacks are 60 years after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? We had that big anniversary in August. And people talk about the I Have a Dream speech, but many people forget that it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. There's a recognition that we needed to address the economics of racial inequality. And I think home ownership and housing get to the base of this economic inequality. Oftentimes say the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. And a quick way to surmise, generally African Americans have about 62 cents on every dollar of income that whites have. But in terms of actual wealth, it goes down to as low as, depending what measures you use, 12 cents, 19 cents on every dollar of wealth that whites have. So we have just a much more massive racial wealth divide, and a racial wealth divide that hasn't been closing for the last 60 years. We estimated it would take, if the racial wealth divide were to continue to close at the rate it has been since 1963, it would take 780 years for African Americans to finally have equal wealth to whites. And so again, the country's not on a path to racial economic inequality, not on a path to racial wealth equality, and home ownership is a primary source of wealth for most Americans. So we have to bridge this home ownership gap, which we've had about a 30% home ownership gap between Blacks and whites, around 43, 44% home ownership rate for African Americans, and around 74% home ownership rate for whites. And this 30% gap has really maintained itself for generations. So, that is going to be an important piece of bridging racial economic inequality.
A lot of the folks who joined us tonight are very familiar with past racist housing policies, such as redlining, but perhaps you could also speak to some of the discriminatory lending practices and appraisal practices that have contributed to this racial wealth gap as well, and continue to perpetuate housing segregation.
Yeah. And, let me go with a little bit of a counterclaim that I think the primary barrier is not contemporary discrimination or outright discrimination, but is more just the wealth divide itself, right? I mean, if you look at what median household income for Blacks is around $47,000, and the median wealth, not including depreciating assets for Blacks in 2019, last time I have good data, was around $9,000. What does it mean to try to develop home ownership for a household of $47,000 of income and $9,000 of total wealth? And we have to address that issue of creating home ownership for lower income, extremely low wealth households to, change the dynamic. Historically, whites haven't always been majority homeowners. It was really in the 1940s with the massive change in government policy that allowed for many with the GI Bill to buy a home with no down payment, with very low interest rates that really increased white home ownership rates towards majority home ownership. I think we're going to need that type of massive investment and subsidy to bridge home ownership inequality today.
Well, yeah, that segues right into the next question, but how can public resources or subsidies such as the Housing Choice Voucher Program or low-income housing tax credits, in your view, be leveraged then to combat this racial wealth gap?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, keep taking your things a little bit out of order. Just one thing about the redlining that I didn't really get to when you asked me the question previously is I do think, even though I think it's primarily about the racial wealth gap today, it is true that you see the effects of redlining still today. We did a report not too long ago on the persistent structure of segregation, economic inequality, HOLC redlining maps, and noted how 64% of the redlined areas that were redlined 80 years ago are still majority minority today, and 74% today are still low income neighborhoods. So clearly the discrimination of the past is reflected in today's reality. I just think it's not so much changing individual discriminatory practices will change it. It's really going to require strong investment in order to do that. Now, I think some of the programs you laid out, it's not going to be one policy thing. There's a whole bunch of different types of policies that can be used that can help address different communities in becoming homeowners. One of the programs I have found, oh man, I'm gonna mess up the name. In Baltimore, gosh, I want to call it equity housing. No, I'm messing up the name. It was really interesting.
Parity? Is it a developer by the name of Parity? No.
Thank
Parity.
Jones, right?
Bree Jones. Uh-huh.
Yeah, very good. I think they've pulled together, and I'm sure I'm talking to many people here who have very interesting programs of working with the city, working with private developers to actually develop homes and create a program that allows for median income, lower income residents to become homeowners. And I do think, it will take, and we're talking more and more to different banks around different type of special purpose credit programs, right? What can be done to lower interest rates, lower down payments? What type of mixing of maybe government investment and private philanthropic investment can be used to also help cover some of the subsidies needed to get people into homes and be homeowners, right? And I think I've always pointed to Baltimore as a very important and unique space where you have it's not like Miami where there aren't enough homes in the first place. There's actually a lot of homes. There's a lot of homes that need to be developed and rebuilt, but you could actually bring in a lot of new residents into Baltimore without pushing out the historic residents of Baltimore. And I think that's really a key opportunity that particularly a high income state like Maryland that has strong job prospects, we should be better taking advantage of. And we have a strong philanthropic sector, as well as, kind of a lot of strong government jobs. So, people sometimes look at Baltimore as a great challenge, and I see there are challenges in Baltimore, but I also think it's one of the greatest opportunities to really turn around some of the problems that the country's been facing for decades.
Absolutely. Maybe I could ask just on that note, while you're familiar with our program and we serve families here in Baltimore City, we are also trying to help families access areas that are outside of the city. And so do you have policy ideas around creating affordable housing in these areas, such as Howard County? And again, like what public resources can be leveraged there where the rental markets actually might be tighter, there's less rental housing, there's less density?
Yeah, I think, people generally want to stay away from strict regulation, but I think that's the only way you're really going to get affordable housing. Is that development should not be allowed without strong affordable housing. And I've seen over and over again people brag about, 10% of this development is going to be for low to moderate people. It's going to be affordable housing. And I'm like, so what you're telling me is 90% of the development's unaffordable? And that's a positive? Like, we shouldn't, as a society, let that to occur. And I understand, there's different interests among the private sector and government, but I think government recognized historically that in order to really create a massive home ownership opportunities, that it's going to require some government subsidies and partner with the private sector. I think we have to get back to that space, that we have to have strong regulation, because we've seen for the last 40, 50 years that the market itself does not provide affordable housing. We've seen it all across the country. So we're going to need much stricter regulation. And as we wait for regulation to occur, I think there's opportunities for local projects that can be done, partnered between, philanthropic groups and developers, about those who don't have to be forced by law to do it, but are willing to do it if they can get some type of support from the city or some other type of investment. So I think that's where the nonprofit sectors can really do important work, is do some usually smaller scale experiments that then could be utilized in larger, hopefully, citywide or regional wide programs.
I appreciate you mentioning the smaller scale experiments. We have some funders on who are engaged with us in such demonstrations and pilots as we speak towards asset building for HCV participants, as well as working with the healthcare sector to bring them into partnership with housing providers and making basically referrals for healthy housing. So absolutely can't say enough about how those initiatives need funding. Can I ask, maybe switching from just the creation of affordable housing and or the construction of more housing broadly, what other barriers do African Americans typically face moving up the social economic ladder? Perhaps you could speak a little bit about how credit is wielded and in the United States to, I feel personally, keep folks locked out of lots of opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm a little bit of a broken record, but I really do see wealth at the center of this. I have this model that I often talk about, called the negative feedback loop of asset poverty. And you talk about, I said the median wealth for African American households around $9,000, and you see there's this deep, lack of private assets. Now, the way most countries deal with this is they make sure that public assets are more greatly provided to low wealth people, so that they'll try to put some of the strongest schools, make sure that some of the lower wealth neighborhoods have the greatest public assets. But in the United States, we oftentimes have our strongest public assets in the most highest income neighborhoods. And so higher income people have stronger public assets. They get stronger service from the market. It's oftentimes talked about how expensive it is to be poor. And so, you go to a grocery store in your area, and it can cost, in a lower income area, it can cost more for inferior goods than it can in a higher income area. The segregation from socioeconomic opportunity, and then obviously the greater financial responsibilities. Even many people who come out of lower income areas and, making very strong salaries, maybe even six-figure salaries, they see that their income doesn't take them as far as it might take their coworkers because, as I was talking to a friend, they were like, I just can't keep up with my coworkers. And I was like, well, you didn't get any down payment assistance for your house, did you? Like, aren't you actually helping to pay the rent for your aunt? Which means that, your income, you have to use much more to, move yourself forward. That doesn't allow you to use some of that income to become investments. So, I kind of, again, pull back to a much larger picture, but I do think, all of those areas, are the center of this kind of wealth inequality. And that is why, we say credit, but credit generally goes along with households' wealth, right? It's very hard to have strong credit with low income and very little wealth, because that means every time you hit a financial challenge, you have nowhere to pull from, and that it will constantly, wear down your credit. So we really have to think of mechanisms. And my head of research will kind of note that historically, in the 50s and 60s, the idea of credit scores weren't really what was used to determine if someone was worthy of, like, say, a mortgage loan. It was actual relationships that local banks would have with individual households, and understanding where they fit in the community and if they felt they could carry this loan over time period, over time. And, and I've seen in programs that have been more successful in having moderate income people have loans, it takes that strong work of understanding the financial situation of a household to do that type of lending, versus just saying, okay, let's do the number crunches, credit score, you're not deemed worthy.
Absolutely. It's definitely, in our view, not a predictor of someone's ability to repay a loan, and not a predictor of someone's ability to pay their rent either. And so often we are seeing credit used, honestly, to say no to providing folks housing, which is very troubling.
On that renting space too, there's also been a lot of discussion, as I'm sure you and your members have, about, even opportunities to build credit for low income. Like, if you are renting, oftentimes that historically has not been a space where you can build credit. So providing, those type of opportunities, again, and I think that's why it's so important. And NCRC is so focused on strengthening economic mobility for low wealth households. I think that wealth analysis has to be central. It can't just be low to moderate income, because you see that even for African Americans, even higher income Africans have radically low wealth. I think the numbers I've seen recently was that the white household with a high school diploma has still about twice the wealth of a Black and Latino household with a college degree, right? So the things we assume that are connected to economic mobility oftentimes don't bring the same wealth returns, and create this kind of challenge of having a Black middle class that's in asset poverty, and is something that must be looked at as we're doing development.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that distinction between not just looking at incomes, but total wealth for those even with potentially moderate incomes. Could you maybe speak to some of the impacts that happen for the Black community and other communities, Latino communities and others, kind of the downstream effects? What does it mean outside of perhaps housing to have low wealth?
Sorry, what does it mean for who to have low wealth?
For the Black community and others. You mentioned the Latino community as well, but just generally those who are marginalized, or those groups who are who have low wealth, like besides housing potentially, yeah. What other kind of like downstream negative effects do they encounter?
Sure, there's been a lot of analysis of education and how we pay for public education, and oftentimes paying it off of taxation on housing. And if you have communities, well, one, we do have the issue of racial inequality, in that you can have a home in a majority Black neighborhood and a home in a majority white neighborhood. It can be the very same home, and it has less value on the market than the black home has less value on the market than the white home. And that's not even getting into this idea of appraisal bias, meaning the appraiser is biased. It's that what the scenario I'm putting forward is just a reflection of the bias in the market, in that such a large part of the market are white Americans who generally do not want to live in neighborhoods that are oftentimes over 20%, 30% African American. So it actually brings down the value of the home. And like, this is a great challenge, because even the things that, you know, when you do everything right, even if you buy a home, even if you go to college, it usually has less of a return, of a wealth return, than it does for white Americans. Now, it's still important, right? Those who, African Americans who get a college degree have much more wealth than African Americans who have a high school degree. But as I noted before, African Americans with a college degree still have less wealth than whites with just a high school degree. So even when things are even when you're doing the right things, you know, we're facing these barriers of inequality. And I think that will only change when we do the investment that to have an African American community no longer means asset poverty, right? And two, we need to turn right side up our asset policies in the United States. Like, we should have the strongest we should be looking for the strongest returns in schooling in the lowest income areas, right? Not in the highest income areas, where the highest income areas, they're also hiring tutors and all these private supports. We should be understanding that lower income, low wealth areas need the strongest public services, the best teachers, which means you have to pay the most, you know, in order to create greater economic mobility and more equitable society too, so that if you have that type of investment in schools, then middle and higher income residents shouldn't have the same type of fears of sending their kids to these schools, because they know their teachers are some of the best in the county or city or wherever you live. So it's going to take a turning right side up or upside down investment policy. I'll say one more thing on that, and I see there's a question. We have this at the national level in terms of tax policy, is we spend almost $800 billion a year in wealth and asset development. It's just the problem is most of the $800 billion goes to the already wealthy. So we don't even have to create new revenue streams. If we could take the $800 billion and actually invest that in low wealth communities, I think we could do a lot to deal with some of the inequality we've been dealing with.
I was just going to ask you to put a number out there for us in terms of what would right sizing mean. And you mentioned 800 billion that is going to like the highest wealth folks in the country. But are there any, you know, have you ever tried to quantify, or in terms of, you know, what would a significant public investment look like?
Well, I mean, there's different ways you can look at it, right? If you just want to know what is the difference, African Americans across the country, I think 2020 data, something like that, had about $3 trillion of wealth. If African Americans had their proportion, their demographic proportion, if African Americans, 13% of the population, had 13% of the wealth, they would have $10 trillion more dollars. They'd have about 13 trillion. So that's one way of highlighting it, is there's a $10 trillion wealth gap for African Americans to have their proportional share of the wealth of this country. I think the important thing that talk about investments, and to kind of bring it down, you know, we do a lot of work with banks, national banks, financial institutions. We did a paper, 60% Black home ownership, a radical goal, 60%, a radical goal for Black home ownership. Not even trying necessarily for Blacks to get to the 74% level of whites, but just to become strongly majority homeowners. We estimated that there would have to be about a doubling of new Black homeowners every year for 20 years just to get African Americans to that 60% home ownership level. And those type of things are things to try to bring down more for local banks or nonprofits. As you know, I like to get a general understanding of what are the challenges and what are the increases we need. And then you can't make the country change all of that, but maybe your local institution can try to double its mortgage lending to African Americans, or try to work to double the Black new homeowners in your community. But definitely it's deep radical change over a long period of time. That's one of the biggest challenges, is every once in a while you can get some momentum to push something forward for a little bit, but wealth doesn't develop and maintain itself after a year or two. You have to have sustained investment in order for this, this kind of issue of wealth inequality we've had for generations to have a generational effect of change.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask the audience now to potentially drop a question into the chat or raise your hand, and we will unmute you to speak if you have a question. So think of your question while I ask one more to Dedrick of my own. Oh, and it might just be escaping me. It was related to the deep radical investment. So in terms of NCRC's work with some of the institutional banks, the lending institutions, are there any that you feel are making significant investments? Are any of them doing better than others? And who might those be?
That's interesting. We actually are releasing a report maybe early next week to look at many national financial institutions made pledges to invest in racial equity following the murder of George Floyd. And it's still really too early to get a deep analysis of that. We were trying to look at what type of investments have occurred. Do we think that they are the type of investments that can lead to long-term change? And we have seen some, I'll say, substantial increase in mortgage lending, but it's for such a brief period of time. We have to be clear about, can this mortgage lending be maintained and really increased over time? And I've been in this space for so long that I'll take any type of improvement if we can just maintain it, because honestly, there's been so little improvement for 20 or 30 years. And like, how is it that African Americans are still at 44% home ownership rates when, that was true 20, 30 years ago, right? How have we not seen a home ownership divide change since really the 1940s, right? We've had so much change in laws and education. There has been, positive economic changes for African Americans. We've increased our educational attainment. The poverty rates have radically changed. In 1963, African Americans had a 51% poverty rate. For that was income poverty. That's radically high. Today, it's more around 20%, which is still too high. It's 1 out of 5 Black Americans, but it's substantially different than 51%. So it's important to see where we have made some progress. And actually, I think important thing about that progress is Black poverty rates went from 51% to 1963 to about 32%, 34% by 1969. And that was just this massive investment war on poverty, Medicare, Medicaid. I think some of the changes that were happening with, outright legal segregation. We had substantive shift, but it really took what they called a war on poverty to make that change. We didn't continue the war. And we've managed to retreat and leave a fifth of African Americans living in poverty, around, not quite 10% of whites in poverty. So it's going to require that type of collective effort. But I do think, just as what it took to move forward the country and the war on poverty, it took local grassroots movements developing best practices and having strong advocacy. And I think we have to really put in development, the center of development has to be affordable housing. It can't just be phrases of equity or opportunity, but no, what percentage is going to be, and affordable housing is not low income housing, as people know. That's just what blows my mind, is we can't even get affordable housing, much less housing for low income people.
Absolutely. So I'm not seeing any questions. Is there anyone who would like to raise their hand, and can unmute you? I definitely have more questions, but I don't want to take up all the time. This is an opportunity to engage directly with our guests tonight, so please don't be shy.
Well, also, I'll put forward, I oftentimes one of the things I like most about my job is when I go to community discussions and hear of the practices that are being done, and getting to kind of see, and add that to our wheelhouse. And so if there's ever, conversations that your organization is doing around, what are your kind of best practices, your promising practices, I would love to sit here and learn from you all instead of y'all just kind of hearing from me. So that's a
Absolutely. I'm happy to perhaps share what some of those are. But real fast, one of our client advisory board members has joined tonight, Yvonne Redmond, and she asks, what programs do you suggest to increase one's credit?
But I think one, some people put forward, okay, oh, well, now we need to, as I mentioned before, have credit scores that take into consideration rental payments. If you look at some of the studies, it's debatable because sometimes people miss rent. And so it doesn't, your rent payment doesn't necessarily just mean it's going to increase. I think what's really required is strong, ongoing financial coaching, counseling that really knows when a household is ready for the next step, right? For the next step and for what program. Because I think there are households that, okay, hey, they've been steady in their job. They might be low income, but they haven't missed a rent payment. This program through this credit union that allows you to build your credit through rental payments, perfect for you. And I think that's generally what we're doing at the local level. Is oftentimes many of the promising programs exist. They're just kind of all over the place and disjointed. And you oftentimes need a household connected to program A over here, D over there, G over here, and that will then allow that household to move up, until a next level. And so I think, just in general, I think it's really important that there be these conversations among groups like yours about how different nonprofits and foundations and anchor institutions can pull together their resources. I do find someone who's worked in the nonprofit sector, it kind of almost weird that too oftentimes nonprofits look at other nonprofits as competitors rather as partners. And because I've been to a lot of nonprofits, a lot of great nonprofits, none of them, no matter how great they are and how well funded they are, can do it all themselves. They need to partner with others. And so, that type of coordination, I think, is really central. So I don't think there's like one program. I think it's the host of programs and how you mix it together and have the attention to really understand which households are ready for which combination.
Absolutely. And that financial coaching is a piece of what our housing mobility program provides. And we have actually partnered with other nonprofits. Compass Working Capital out of Boston is a sister organization that does a lot of the coaching to build wealth and leverages the Family Self-Sufficiency HUD funded program nationally with housing providers. So absolutely, to your point around collaboration, it's really key. Another question here from one of my BRHP colleagues, Adaye Andrews. What are your thoughts on employment as it relates to economic mobility? Obviously, people need to be able to earn a living to be able to afford a home.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been big in this racial wealth divide, racial wealth gap space. And sometimes people are like, oh, it's wealth, it's not income. It's wealth, it's not employment. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, you don't get wealth by being unemployed, right? It's employment, income, and wealth, right? It's just kind of wealth as a central indicator of your overall economic security. So you're 100% right. There needs to be strong employment. And again, I was talking about, I guess, financial coaching. Words people use now more is financial capability. And this idea of, building assets for households, right? So, one important asset could be affordable housing, right? Another important asset is making sure that households are aware of job opportunities, have ongoing streams of income. Another asset can make sure they're getting their healthcare issues being provided. Another asset is that their kids have an after-school program. I look at this economic mobility as pulling together different assets to create wealth, which includes obviously employment, and have done some interesting analysis of employment opportunities in Baltimore City versus Baltimore County, and kind of racial disparities in those employment opportunities. But clearly, there has to be, and I think one positive thing, because I talk a lot of challenges, we have been for the last few years outside of the heights of the COVID crisis, have had some of the tightest labor markets we've had in quite a while, with some of the lowest level of Black unemployment. Now, lowest level Black unemployment is like around 6%, which is still getting close to where whites are in a recession. But I think it is really central that nationally and at the state level, we look at how can we maintain these tight labor markets and even strengthen them, right? With either, some's gonna be summer job programs for youth, or actually, creating strong, and actually, partnering with anchor institutions to make sure that the job opportunities that people from the suburbs are coming in for are connected to actually job opportunities for local residents that, even though they might be in the city, are disconnected from the economic opportunities in the city.
For sharing that. Another question here from an audience member, Tony Asian asks, are there programs that coach people on maintaining a home, not just purchasing a home? Someone who has never owned may not be aware of all the preventive things that need to happen, and one emergency can make them lose that home. And perhaps this also speaks to how you said, like, as a whole, we haven't really seen African Americans progress in terms of being able to own their homes. They're kind of at this stagnant 40% rate. And perhaps that's because they've fallen in and out of home ownership. But what are are you aware of any programs, or what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, and I think, this gets to the importance. And again, it's the market doesn't really provide financial education ongoing from when you're 20 or 18 throughout your life, unless you have a lot of money and assets, right? That's the only time that you have really financial coaches there. And so we have so many programs about, we're going to do some financial capacity training to get you a job, right? But then you have your job, but it's usually not maintained, right? Or, all right, now we're going to get you into a home, but there's strong financial coaching that needs to happen after you get the home. How do you maintain your home? How do you pay off your home the fastest possible? What's the next step after you've been in your home? Are you about to pay it off? What's the next step? So, and I haven't seen a model of this. I think it's very challenging, but how do you make a kind of a contiguous model of financial coaching, financial capability from the, I don't have a job, I don't have a place to live, and have that maintained to all the way through, okay, I have a home and I'm turning 70 or 80, and I need to figure out what to do with the assets I have. Should I put it in a trust? So that if I have to go into a home, which happens so oftentimes, people go into home, they've managed to save a few $100,000 in assets, and then they spend it all in the last 6 months of life, with some type of medical situation, right? And if there was a trust set aside, some of that could be addressed. So, what are the ways we can kind of pass? And it's not just for low-income people. It's higher income African Americans are losing the most wealth with this lack of asset transfer, because they have the most wealth, right? But there isn't that type of education. So I think you're highlighting a challenge. I don't have the clear solution other than, I would ask for, cities, philanthropic organizations to figure out how can we have more of a contiguous model. So it's never you're out of a financial capability program. It's now you're on to the next level of, financial capability.
Absolutely. I'm going to unmute my colleague, Dan Pontius from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, or maybe the facilitators can unmute Dan. He has a lengthy question in the chat, and I think he'd be the best to speak to it. Dan, are you able to unmute?
Yeah, I can. I can even.
Wonderful.
Hey, Dedrick, how are you? I'm also on the board of the Columbia Housing Center, so I'm very familiar with Columbia, and worked with Dedrick a little bit on their Columbia report, which is terrific. But my question is about, I work with local governments about on affirmatively furthering fair housing, and one of the things we're trying to tackle is racial homeownership gaps. And so we've really, actually, your colleague Ibijoke Akimboale has really kind of directed us towards programs that we thought would be, race conscious, really try to tackle these racial inequities directly. But it seems like the banks just target geographically. So they'll have a program that provides down payment assistance if you're going to buy a home in a majority Black or Latino neighborhood. And I don't know if you have thoughts. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that and whether those programs might actually help Black and Latino home buyers buy homes anywhere they want to buy.
Well, I do think I just put in the chat, this is a little different, but I do think it's important. There's a lack of courage to use special purpose credit programs. Special purpose credit programs are programs that allow you to use categories like race and have programs that are for racial groups, because if you can show there's been a history of discrimination against those groups. And so people are using special purpose credit programs, but as Dan's pointing out, they oftentimes won't do a special purpose credit program for African-American homeowners. They'll do something about what majority Black neighborhoods, majority Latino neighborhoods. And I think those can be positive. I think what's important though is that when we look at these programs, too oftentimes people will pat themselves on the back for having a program. You should only pat yourself on the back if your program is moving toward the goal you want to. So I've had this with financial institutions where they were saying like, oh, well, we have this many, racial equity people in our organization. I was like, I kind of don't care. Like, if you can have none, you can have 100, but what is your hiring like? What is your lending like? That's what I care about. If you need to hire 200 racial equity professionals to change your lending, okay, then do it. If you can just change your lending, you don't have to hire any racial equity professionals. I mean, I'm a racial equity professional, but I'm doing fine. Like, I don't need more jobs. So just change your lending. Like, you don't have to hire this unprofessional. So, I think there can be some benefits, but obviously the most cost-effective, efficient way of dealing with racial inequality is investing in those groups directly and saying we're going to create programs for Black homeowners, for Latino homeowners. And it's not just Black, again, low income, because Black mid-income, even higher income, you see in every level have less rates of homeownership, less equity in their home. So I do think we need more courage. And that's why I put the article in here. People get nervous about the Supreme Court affirmative action ruling. We do have some of our lawyers highlighting how it is legal to use special purpose credit programs, even in this political environment. And particularly private institutions have the greatest leeway to do it. So we should be pushing them the most to do such things.
A lot of applause on this side of the house for that response. I'm going to now turn to our final question and then offer you an opportunity to make any closing remarks before I close this out. But what steps can individuals or organizations take to support housing equity and economic mobility for Black Americans and other marginalized communities? Could you give us maybe just, a couple ideas on action steps that we all can take?
Yeah, and let me put forward, I would love to work with you or have more in-depth conversations. I've, in the past, tried to do some work because there is, financial capacity, financial capability, financial education is important. But if it doesn't have an analysis and understanding of racial wealth inequality, that's not strong financial literacy. That's not strong financial education, because you're ignoring the really deep challenges individuals and communities have in wealth building. It's very hard to build wealth when your community is in asset poverty, your household is in income poverty, and it takes really specific types of steps to kind of move forward economically, right? So I've worked with groups and kind of try to create different type of asset building models and helping people to understand, it's not necessarily you expect in 2 years that you had nothing in savings, and then in 2 years you're gonna have $20,000 in savings, right? You're gonna start off probably with nothing in savings and wanting to get out of debt. That might take 2 to 4 years. It might be you now want to move to an affordable home that's in a safer neighborhood and community. That might take another 2 or 3 years, but that's an asset, and your financial coach should be noting, here are assets you're building even though it might not be in your banking account. I want it to eventually hit your banking account, but there are so many assets outside of your banking account that are essential before you can, even literally have a banking account. You have to have so many things going right for you even have a banking account. So that type of financial education, capacity building, I haven't seen enough of, and I always want to work with local groups to strengthen that if any of my analysis or partners that do this type of work can be of help.
Absolutely. Well, we will be sure to take you up on that as a follow-up for this discussion. I just want to say, again, a big thanks to Dedrick Asante-Muhammad for such an insightful conversation, and to all of you who joined us tonight. We would love to stay in touch with you, and we would encourage you to sign up for our newsletter by visiting our website at brhp.org or following us on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, and we have our own YouTube channel. So please consider following us. Stay tuned for future BRHP In Conversation events. And with that, have a great evening.
Thanks again.
Take care.